people who are grieving after a death, but also people who are grieving a separation, say of a relationship, or the loss of just something very significant in their lives, will often experience a misunderstanding from others, where other people assume that grief is over in 3 months, or grief is over in a year. It's like, what? You're still grieving that? It's been a year already. Like, when are you going to choose to be okay? Now, of course, people can wallow in grief. That does happen. And people can get stuck in grief, even though they don't want to be, through certain kinds of psychological mistakes. All that stuff happens, but the vast majority of times, that's not the case. And it's not the case that it's a moral fault when a person's stuck in grief. Like sometimes it is, and actually, often enough, there are dimensions of that, like, fostering resentment in yourself, or whatever it is that you have to let go of. But even then, that's part of human nature to be like that. So there's a dimension there of taking it easy on yourself and accepting that, and not as long as you don't buy into it, recognizing that I keep getting resentful and it's hard not to. Now, this is part of the bigger point I'm making. Grief can last a long time, and there's a lot of it that's out of your control. I often talk about what's in your control and out of your control, and it's not because I'm just on repeat or because I don't have much more to say. It's because get this point. I need to get this point. You need to get this point. If this really sunk into us deeply, you and I would be living very different lives right now. Grasping what's in your control and what's out of your control, and acting according to that, and feeling according to that, thinking according to that. Grief, as I say, after death or after a relationship loss or a betrayal or the loss or violation of something very significant in your life, to my mind, well, there's two aspects to the grief. There's kind of like one dimension where you will always grieve, you'll always miss, there'll always be a wound in your life. And there's no reason that shouldn't be the case. Why shouldn't it be the case that you collect sorrows as you walk through life? Oh, that's a pessimistic, or that's a negative, or that's a very dark view of life. Welcome to life. It's got suffering in it, and it's got wounds. It's also got good things and wonderful things. I mean, I'm a counsellor. That's because of this shit, this because of the good stuff. Let's make that happen. But you got to accept the darkness in life as well, and the pain and the hurt. That's real too. And if you can't accept that, you can't really live properly and truly in the zone of the good stuff. All you're doing is jumping into a manic perspective or a denial. You want to live in lucid, healthy, true happiness. You got to be able to accept the degree to which suffering is also a deep part of life. So, there's that. As I say, there's that kind of grief which you'll always have. There are wounds which you might always have. That's one part of grief, but there's two parts. There's this other part I call the distress period. The distress period is what we often think of as grief, of whatever sort, as I'm saying. There's all kinds, situations, relationship breakdown, loss of anything significant, violation of anything significant. There's the distress period where you're working through the storm of emotions, the sadness, the anger, the resentment, the sense of unfairness, the fear, whatever it is, and it's usually a bunch of different things, the guilt. That period, if we're dealing with something really significant in your life, I think typically lasts about 5 to 10 years. If you go through a divorce and you love the person, say you're married 10 years, expect and say you felt like the relationship needed to end and it was the right thing, you might still grieve and deal with that in this way for 5 years. If you didn't want to be left, and it felt like your life was ruined by this, and all your dreams and hopes and the children you wanted and all that was ruined by this, maybe it's 10 years. Now that sounds crazy because you think, yeah, but people, they end up with other people within 2 years, or they seem happy and fine. Well, this is the reason people say to somebody, and I've seen this time and time again with bereaved clients, people will say to them 3 months in after they found their loved one hanging, oh, you're still suffering, you're still grieving. Like, serious? 12 weeks later, you're still suffering? Of course, I'm trying not to swear too much. Of course, you're suffering. A year in, oh, you found your child hanging a year ago. You're still suffering? For crying out bloody loud. Of course you're still suffering. Yeah. That's So we're kind of a bit stupid about this stuff, and I think it's a kind of defense, because most of us go through grief, but then we kind of erase it. There's also an egotism there, because we think our grief is particularly special and powerful and real, and then we're blind to other different kinds of grief. We're frustrated that people don't get ours, but then we won't get others. So my big point here is that this grief takes a lot longer than we want to recognize, and people can, this grieving person, like I'm talking about, 3 months in or 12 months in, might be smiling and laughing. That's because they're a complex human being with many parts. They're also grieving that day. You can do both. We're not cliches. We're complex human beings. Think about yourself. Think about the various dimensions of you and the masks you wear and the way you only show certain parts of yourself to certain people. Everybody else is like that. We're all doing the same thing. We're holding pain quietly, keeping it to ourselves, hopefully, in the sense of not oversharing and not making the whole of life about this, but we're also grieving and in pain. So that's real, and just because a person's laughing doesn't mean they're not grieving. And so also, just because a person's in love with somebody else 2 years or 4 years in doesn't mean they're not also still working through the grief of what happened before. So a person goes through a divorce, and 2 years or 2.5 years later they're dating somebody else, and they're actually really happy, and maybe they're feeling love for this other person. Doesn't mean they're not also still grieving and suffering that prior relationship, in the sense that they're still feeling pain at different times. They're still feeling anger and having to work through that. This anger that wasn't in their life before, but because they got betrayed and their partner left, and they've still got this distrust and anger, and it takes a long time to work through this stuff. So this is my big point. There are things that are in your control and things that are out of your control. Now, if you're feeling anger or resentment or sorrow or guilt or whatever it is, fear, distrust, anxiety, you can change these things, but it might take a long time to change them. So it's in your control to change them. It's not in your control to change them now, or maybe even 3 months from now. Maybe 3 years in, you're still struggling to get out of the anger. It keeps coming to you because you were betrayed and you were hurt so deeply, and you don't want to be in it, but it comes again. And you dream about it, and you wake up in the morning and you're sad or you're angry again. You didn't choose to have that dream. Why are you still dreaming about it twice a week, or even more or less, or whatever? It's still there. Or it's the sorrow, whatever it is. You don't get a choice about your human nature and the fact that things can happen, or people can do things to you that leave you struggling, and that can take years to deal with inside. And that's just a reality. While you can also be smiling, you can also be genuinely laughing, you can also be genuinely finding good versions of what you lost in life, but also at the same time still grieving or struggling. So why am I saying all this in this video? Because there's a lot of people who'll be watching this who have probably felt like there's something wrong with them, because 3 years or 5 years or 8 years in, they were still struggling with what happened. And I think, what the hell's wrong with me? And I'm talking especially to people who've tried to work through it and tried to get rid of it, and yet it's still happening. Okay, I understand this is normal. There's not something wrong with you. You're being a human being.